When putting together the front end of a web application, we have to think about where the information will come from, how we will display it, and how we will switch from view to view, and how we will update it based on new data coming in or actions by the user. Typically, we have the data come from an API, and we try to separate the model from the view. So we have our API layer at the base, and from there, we get and update the data in our business code and then render it to our view. Unfortunately, it is easy to slip into some problems. First, when the API is developed together with the front end, often the API ends up getting a lot of logic for transforming and preparing the data to be rendered, and there are endpoints tailored to particular views. The reasons typically is to avoid several API requests and merging the data on the front end. Often, the API is already doing some amount of data preparation, so it's easy to just have the API endpoint collect some more data and send it all at once. Also, it's easy to slip into putting the logic that gets and updates the data into the view itself, where if you deleted the view components, much of your business logic would disappear with them. Many applications start from a high-quality application framework, but often follow this degeneration pattern, where a lot of code that is getting data from the API and validating data and performing other business logic ends up inside the view. But why did the simple concept of API plus business code and separate view not happen? Since these applications are composed of many components, and each component has a logic section where it gathers and updates data, and then renders it to the view section. It's very tempting to just get the data you need right from the source, or perform some business validation or API request based on an event happening in these components. What we would like to do is truly separate our view from the application. This would make it incredibly easy to do site redesigns and new layouts, and would allow better testing of the view against mock-up data. The goal then would be to make a representation of the data that the view uses, but keep it separate from the view. This is a separate layer from the model. If we can achieve this, then it would be much easier to maintain views and do significant changes to the view without refactoring the code that gets and saves data and maintains the states. Further, it would be much easier to allow other kinds of interfaces for the same data, such as very simplified versions of the views for accessibility, or voice-only views, or 3D WebGL-based or other view technologies. So we're talking about a view model, which could attach to different views. It is not just a data model because it keeps some state about the current context and what actions are available in the current context. This is key because a lot of application code has to do with loading and presenting a subset of all the data and actions that the application works with. Now, again, it seems obvious, but what are the challenges that we will have? If we look at a view, we can see there is a header, sidebar, and some course cards. So if we decompose that into components, each one would need some code to manage the state and what is going on in that section. But when we actually go to implement it, typically we further decompose the view into some reusable components. And those components often we decompose the further into some standard UI elements. And all of these elements are in danger of having business code, business validations, and business data transformations. All of this is heavily coupled to the view, so that we feel if we deleted the view components, much of our application's logic would disappear. To solve this, we need to separate out all the logic and data access and validation and transformations from the whole hierarchy of components. So we make two separate hierarchies. One does all the business logic and talks to the model and maintains the state of the view. And on top, there is a hierarchy of completely separate, simple, individually testable view components, which are custom HTML elements tailored to display the data needed by the application. We need to focus very carefully on this data view layer. Our application main code should be able to initialize the data views, and the views then should expect events and function calls, and should update observable properties that cause the view to then be updated based on this data view state. So our main application layers are the API, and we have the model which gets, stores, and validates data, and then we have this business data view layer. You can think of this as objects that represent the page, but often a page really is composed of persistent things like a header, so that the page changes, but the header stays the same. So the application should be able to swap out data views and maintain several data views active at once. Finally, the view itself should be separated into a set of basic reusable UI elements like buttons and drop-downs and the application components. Additionally, the application model would typically not directly make web requests, but use some kind of client-side wrapper of the relevant API requests. Each of these layers should be able to be tested independently of the others, so just the plain HTML view code is a pretty small portion of the application. Yet many application builders make the mistake of fitting most of their code into this view layer. The error often comes from using a view-building library like React or Svelte, and treating it like an application framework, and writing all the business code in context of this view framework. If the design system provides an extensible way to add custom app-specific components, then there is very little need for any third-party framework. Rather, structuring your application this way is in itself a framework. Whether you implement this by making a base class for each of these item types, or just concretely implement an app-specific class for each of them while following the structure, the result can be an application that truly separates the view in a way that allows very fast future iteration on the actual site design.